Welcome to Session 0. My name is John, and this series is about everything that happens before the dice ever roll. This session will focus on a series of tools designed to aid you in constructing a narrative campaign with a nonlinear structure. Before discussion of technique, we need to be clear about the problems this session is actually addressing. This session is not about writing better scenes or improvisation, and it is not about trying to anticipate every possible player choice. It's about something much more specific. How do we design a campaign so that player freedom can exist without destroying our ability to produce a meaningful ending? We're not trying to build a living sandbox. Instead, we're trying to solve three practical design problems that appear the moment a campaign becomes nonlinear. How do we create a story ending that actually reflects the path the players took? How do we track the decisions and consequences that matter without drowning in bookkeeping? And how do we reduce an unbounded decision space into a small, readable set of variables that we can actually resolve? Those three problems define the scope of this session. The tools in this session are intended for campaign design that is completed prior to play. They assume you are willing to define, at minimum, the major narrative beats of your arc and the questions you want the ending of that arc to answer before Session 1 ever begins. Nonlinear narrative design is a substantially larger investment than traditional linear preparation. If your current goal is simply to improve table engagement, pacing, or player motivation inside a mostly linear structure, I strongly recommend starting with Session 0 mapping player motivation instead. Likewise, the methods described below are fundamentally incompatible with unbounded structure-first improvisation and the living sandbox model. They are designed for curated play within a bounded narrative scope. When we attempt to design nonlinear narrative at scale, we encounter three systemic challenges that must be addressed. The first is constraint. How do we lock scope and prevent uncontrolled narrative sprawl? The second is control. How do we define and track the variables that actually matter to the story? And lastly, collapse. How do we turn those variables into a coherent outcome without flattening player agency? To address these problems, we will introduce three tightly coupled design tools: reverse design to constrain scope, conditional flags to control narrative variables, and state collapse to resolve those variables into outcomes. These are not independent techniques or optional enhancements. They form a single system. Reverse design defines what is allowed to matter. Conditional flags allow us to observe and pass forward what happens. And state collapse allows us to resolve those flags into usable narrative outcomes. Used together, they form a control system for nonlinear narrative. Used in isolation, they are far less effective. Throughout this session, we will use a single 3-quest arc from my in-development module, The Trouble with Hobbs, as a worked example. A free preview of the Brumble Grove arc featured is linked in the description for those who would like to follow along narratively. For the purposes of this session, we will be treating that arc as a data model, not a story. Brumble Grove demonstrates branching state resolution, rather than branching story paths, but the same reverse design, conditional flag, and state collapse tools shown here are exactly what allow branching narratives of any scale to remain coherent. Most traditional GM preparation begins by assembling assets. NPCs, locations, encounters, items, factions, and these are treated as the core work of campaign design. Once those pieces exist, the players are dropped into the collection and the GM waits for the story to emerge. Sometimes it does. Very often, it does not. What this approach is actually doing is manufacturing parts without any shared specification. Each element is designed in isolation, and only after they exist do we attempt to assemble them into a story. If a satisfying, personalized narrative is, let's say, a finished puzzle, then this approach is fundamentally backwards. It is equivalent to manufacturing puzzle pieces before deciding what picture the puzzle is supposed to form. The pieces are different sizes. They have different edge shapes. They connect to different ideas. And most importantly, they were never designed to fit into a single image. The result is not a coherent picture. It is a collage of player moments, memorable scenes, interesting characters, occasionally powerful interactions, but very rarely a story that feels, in retrospect, like a single, intentional, curated experience. If we want a nonlinear story to feel personal and reactive while still feeling authored, then our design process must mirror the structure of an actual puzzle. The picture has to exist before the pieces are created. Every piece must be cut to the same scale of meaning, and every piece must exist because it contributes to that final image. Traditional asset-first preparation does not fail because GMs are bad writers. It fails because the parts were never designed to form a whole. If we accept that a satisfying nonlinear story is something we must solve, not something that passively emerges, then our preparation has to change. We can no longer start by creating pieces. We have to start by defining the picture. And that shift is what this session is all about. We approach nonlinear narrative design as a three-stage construction process. Reverse design paints the picture. It defines what the completed story must ultimately express. Conditional flags cut the pieces. They reduce narrative possibility into standardized, trackable sections of state that all operate at similar scales of meaning. State collapse assembles the puzzle. It determines how those pieces finally click together to produce a concrete, usable outcome. Together, these tools turn nonlinear storytelling from an act of hopeful improvisation into a solvable design problem. At a surface level, reverse design sounds trivial. It's often summarized as simply start at the end. But in nonlinear narrative design, reverse design is not a storytelling trick. It's a scope constraint strategy. Reverse design exists to deliberately constrain what your story is allowed to care about. Before we create a scene or an NPC or design an encounter, we first ask two very specific questions. What must be true at the conclusion of this story? And what information would we actually need in order to resolve that ending meaningfully? These are not questions about plot beats, they are questions about resolution requirements. In other words, what facts about the world must exist at the end of the arc in order for us to determine how the story concludes? These facts become our end state variables. Reverse design begins by identifying those variables and committing to them in advance. This is what creates your narrative constraint. Instead of allowing the story to generate an unlimited number of potentially relevant details, relationships, and outcomes, reverse design defines a deliberately small set of things that are allowed to matter when the arc is over. Everything else is permitted to exist, but it is not allowed to influence the final resolution unless it can be expressed through one of the predefined variables. This is the critical shift. Reverse design is not about writing the ending in advance. It's about defining what information the ending will be permitted to use. Once that boundary exists, every subsequent design decision becomes a process of feeding information into a known destination. You're no longer designing a story, you're designing a system that produces an outcome. And that's why reverse design is fundamentally about constraint, but it doesn't limit creativity. It limits relevance. As we've discussed previously, traditional forward narrative design usually begins with content. We create locations, NPCs, encounters, and we then attempt to connect them through branching logic. Most commonly, this takes the form of conditional structures. If the players do X, then Y happens. If they refuse, then Z happens. If they attack, then A happens. This approach works well for small, tightly controlled sequences. It fails structurally as soon as the narrative becomes nonlinear. The problem here is unbounded variable creation. When you start at the beginning and allow the story to branch, the only thing limiting how many variables exist is how many possibilities you are willing, or able, to imagine. Every new branch introduces a new state. Every new state multiplies the number of possible future states. Every attempt to anticipate player action multiplies the size of the system. This is what produces what we call decision blossom. Every decision fans outward. Every fan introduces new paths. Every new path introduces new conditions that must now be remembered, evaluated, and carried forward. This creates combinatorial sprawl. Combinatorial sprawl is a rapidly growing web of interconnected conditions, many of which are only locally meaningful and have no clear relationship to the eventual resolution of the story. The result is a narrative that becomes increasingly difficult to track, increasingly difficult to reason about, and nearly impossible to resolve cleanly. At a systems level, this is equivalent to building an assembly line without knowing what product it's meant to produce. Parts are added freely, processes accumulate, but nothing is optimized for an outcome, so waste increases, bottlenecks appear, and eventually the system becomes so complex that meaningful control is lost. Reverse design exists to invert that relationship. Instead of expanding outward towards an unknown ending, we begin by defining the needs of the ending itself. We identify the minimum set of narrative facts required to resolve the arc, we lock them, we name them, and we treat them as the only variables that will be permitted to survive to the end of the system. From that point forward, narrative design becomes a process of reduction. We're no longer trying to predict every possible path the players might take. We're constructing a narrative manifold whose sole purpose is to produce values for a known set of variables. Rather than branching endlessly outward, now we collapse inward towards resolution. We do not design for possibility, we design for convergence. This is the defining property of reverse design. By knowing what must be resolved at the end, we eliminate the need to account for an infinite number of narrative permutations along the way. The story no longer blossoms outward, it funnels forward. This is what makes nonlinear narrative controllable. To demonstrate what reverse design actually looks like in practice, we will use a single 3-quest arc from The Trouble with Hobbes. For the purposes of this session, we are not interested in scenes, characters, or plot beats. We're only interested in the resolution interface of the arc. In other words, what information must exist at the end of this arc in order for the rest of the campaign to be able to meaningfully react to it. The Brumble Grove arc exists to determine whether the Brumble Beast herd becomes a viable political and military asset later in the campaign. This is the only narrative function this arc is allowed to serve. Everything inside this arc must exist to answer that question. Before any quests were designed, the arc was constrained by the following in-state questions. Is the Brumble Beast herd politically stable? Who ultimately controls the herd? If control shifts to a matriarch, does she possess a legitimate patriarchal figure through whom she can rule? Which of the royal heirs survive the internal conflict? And what effective strength does the herd contribute when called upon later? These questions define the entire resolution surface of the arc. If the arc cannot answer one of these questions, then it has failed its design purpose. If an internal event does not meaningfully affect one of these questions, then it is not allowed to influence the outcome of the arc. These questions define our end-state variables and become the effective output of the story. The critical act of reverse design is locking your scope to these variables. The arc is not designed to answer who was morally correct, how the conflict felt emotionally, which characters were liked. Those things may exist inside play, but they are not allowed to exist inside resolution. Only the defined in-state variables may influence downstream content. This immediately constrains the entire design space. Before a single quest was written, reverse design has already established what information must be produced, how much information is allowed to survive, and the form that information must take. This allows every later design decision to be evaluated against a simple rule. Does this content generate, transform, or clarify one of our end-state variables? And if it does not, it cannot affect the outcome of the arc. At this stage, nothing of substance has been written. There are no encounters, no locations, no arcs, no branching scenes. Only a constrained resolution surface exists. This is reverse design. We have defined the picture before creating the pieces. Reverse design defines what must matter at the end of the story. But defining what matters does not, by itself, give us control over how we arrive there. We still need a way to observe what actually happens during play without trying to predict how the players will make it happen. That is the purpose of conditional flags. A conditional flag is a deliberately simple representation of narrative state. It is a recorded condition about the world. In its most basic form, a flag answers a yes or no question. Is this NPC alive? Is this faction still unified? Was this location secured? Each of these is a concrete fact about the world. We record them as flags because concrete facts collapse cleanly. They can be evaluated later without ambiguity, reinterpretation, or narrative reconstruction. In other words, a flag is not a memory aid, instead it's a resolution material, a unit of narrative state designed to be consumed by a later system. A conditional flag is not a record of what players did. For example, the party negotiated with the Duke. The party failed a persuasion check. The party used a ritual. These are actions, and actions are not stable state. They are methods. Methods do not generalize. They explode in number, they cannot be predicted, and most importantly, they cannot be reliably reused to resolve later content. This is the central mistake of forward-branching narrative design. It attempts to preserve player agency by tracking choices. But, as we've discussed, the number of possible choices in an imagination-driven medium is unbounded. So control cannot come from tracking decisions. It can only come from tracking outcomes. This leads to the defining requirement of a usable conditional flag. A conditional flag must be method agnostic. A method agnostic flag represents the final consequence of player interaction with a variable, without encoding how that consequence was achieved. A flag must resolve to the same state regardless of whether the players negotiate, fight, deceive, sacrifice, or fail catastrophically, or even abandon adventuring entirely to become cobblers. If the outcome in the fiction is the same, the flag result will be the same. This is not a stylistic preference, but a structural necessity. If your tracking system is tied to specific methods of interaction, it will inevitably fail to capture reality at the table. The only thing that can be reliably observed and reused later is the resulting state of the world. This concept boils down to one key phrase: plan consequences, not choices. This can sound counterintuitive. Method-agnostic design sounds, on the surface, like it flattens player creativity, but in practice, it does the opposite. By refusing to care how a flag is set, the system stops attempting to constrain player behavior. Players are free to invent solutions. The design only asserts one rule: when the dust settled, the world must be left in a state that can be recorded. This is what preserves player agency while still preserving systemic coherence. Not every moment in a story needs to be turned into a flag. You can track as many local, temporary, or situational variables as you like while running a scene. It's not an issue. Flags only become necessary when a piece of information must survive beyond its immediate context. If a fact about the world influences the progression of later quests, alters the behavior of future encounters, or contributes to the final resolution of the arc, then it must be represented as a method-agnostic conditional flag. If it does not, it is superfluous for the purposes of your narrative system. And this distinction is critical. Flags are not a universal bookkeeping layer. They're an interface layer that we resolve. Once we begin using conditional flags, a new problem appears. Flags do not exist in isolation. They flow forward. A campaign arc is not a single evaluation point, but a sequence of stages. Each stage produces information, and some of that information matters only locally. Some of it must persist to the end, and this forms what we call a flag pipeline. The flag pipeline is the structured flow of conditional flags through the progression of an arc. As the story advances, new flags are introduced. Existing flags may be consulted, and some flags may modify how later stages behave. Others may expire once their purpose has been served. Flags in an arc can therefore be divided into two broad categories: flags that are only relevant to intermediate stages of the arc, and flags that will survive to the final resolution. Both are valid, both are useful. They are not interchangeable. Because we use reverse design, we already know what information the ending is allowed to use. We know the outflows of our pipeline before we design the interior. And this is what prevents narrative sprawl from re-entering the system. The internal complexity of the arc is allowed to be high. Many flags can exist inside the pipeline, and they can influence encounter scenes and outcomes. But when the arc reaches its terminus, only a constrained, predefined set of flags is permitted to exist. And these are the end state variables defined during reverse design. All other flags must either have already been consumed or have already been collapsed into one of these final flags. This is an important property of the pipeline. The internal structure may branch or recombine, but the output interface is fixed. This separation is what allows a quest arc to be both expressive and resolvable. You can afford rich, messy, politically complex story logic inside the pipeline, but you never allow that complexity to leak forward into your resolution layer. The pipeline absorbs chaos. The terminus produces clarity. We are now going to use the Brumblegrove arc to demonstrate how conditional flags move through a pipeline, and how intermediate flags are allowed to exist without ever polluting our final resolution space. Remember, we're treating this arc as a data model, not a story. From reverse design, we already established the only information this arc is allowed to use: who controls the herd, whether that leadership is legitimate, whether the herd is politically stable, which heirs survive, and how strong the herd's contribution will be later. Those are our final outflow variables. Everything else in this arc exists only to help produce those values. The first quest of the three introduces several tracked variables. Importantly, none of them are final outcome variables. These are pipeline inputs. The flags generated here are Chief Barleyhorn respects the party, Chief Barleyhorn was rescued quickly, Chief Cloverhide respects the party, or Chief Cloverhide was reached quickly. These flags do not answer any of our end state questions. No leadership, legitimacy, or stability is established. They are therefore not allowed to exit the arc. However, they're still critical. Why? Because they modify later decisions. They change who will support the party politically, who will intervene later, and who will have the authority to disrupt or stabilize later outcomes. These are intermediate control flags. They exist to shape the internal behavior of the pipeline. Now, notice what is not tracked during these flags. We do not track how the chieftains were saved, tactics used in battle, whether the players were stealthy, diplomatic, reckless, or clever. All of that is method. Only the resulting state that can influence later stages is allowed to survive, not the method through which it was accomplished. In the second quest, The Scandal at Herdfather's Grove, the majority of the arc's internal complexity is generated. And this is where you can see the pipeline clearly operating. This quest imports the flags from Quest 1, and these flags now support who supports which claim or is willing to intervene. But again, those Quest 1 flags still do not become final output variables. They're still internal modifiers. This second quest will generate flags such as who controls the herd, whether a viable puppet exists, or whether each royal heir survives. These are different in kind. These are now directly aligned with our reverse designed end state questions, so these are candidates for final outflow. Some Quest 1 flags directly influence whether these Quest 2 flags can be set in certain ways. A chieftain who respects the party may block a political maneuver or intervene in a confrontation. It doesn't directly change the end state, it changes how later end state flags are allowed to resolve. This is the central pattern of the pipeline. Earlier flags constrain or enable later flag transitions. They do not replace them. The third quest on the arc imports nearly every flag generated so far. At this point, the pipeline is very heavily populated. It consumes leadership state, legitimacy, chieftain support, heirs, and prior political outcomes, and produces the final set of flags required to answer our reverse designed questions. For example, whether the internal conflict escalates, whether casualties are severe, or whether key figures survive the confrontation. This quest can radically upend previously stable outcomes. For example, Aurora may be ruling through Haywain as a puppet, a normally legitimate way to stabilize the herd. However, if Cloverhide respects the party, he can intervene in events, causing Haywain to potentially be killed, instantly invalidating the legitimacy structure, which in turn destabilizes the herd. This is extremely important. No new end state variable is created in this situation. The same final variables still exist, but the pipeline allows earlier flags to modify the transitions between those variables. At the terminus of this pipeline, only flags that answer our reverse design questions are allowed to exist. Every other flag must have already been consumed, transformed, or collapsed into those values. The chieftain respect flags and rescue timing flags do not survive through the end. Their only purpose was to shape later flags that do matter. In summation, you're allowed to have many flags, and you're allowed to have a complex internal state, or flags that recur across multiple quests, but only those that can be expressed as part of your final resolution interface are allowed to leave the arc. Everything else exists purely to control how the internal machinery behaves. By the end of our third quest, we don't have a story, we have a fully populated resolution interface. The system now knows who leads, whether it's legitimate, whether the herd is stable, which of the royal figures are alive, and how strong the herd will be. It has absorbed 3 quests of player chaos and political complexity. Only structured state remains. And that is what makes our next tool, State Collapse, possible. Once conditional flags exist, the final step in the system is state collapse. State collapse is the moment where we stop tracking possibility and deliberately resolve meaning. Up to this point, our tools exist to preserve player agency and track the evolving state of the world. But tracking alone does not produce payoff. Payoff only exists when the system is able to turn accumulated state into a concrete outcome. State collapse is the deliberate termination of variable independence. Multiple tracked flags are evaluated together and reduced into a small, determinative set of narrative results by applying a predefined resolution interface. In simpler terms, flags are inputs, state collapse is the resolver. This is the step where a complex story becomes a usable result. Most nonlinear narrative design breaks down at the ending. It breaks down because the GM is asked all at once to interpret dozens of prior events, remember which moments mattered, judge their relative importance, and invent a satisfying resolution on the spot. This almost always forces one of 2 failures. The ending collapses into improvisational vagueness, or the ending quietly ignores much of what actually happened. State collapse exists specifically to prevent this. It replaces improvisational resolution with structured interpretation. The system does not attempt to predict player behavior. It only evaluates the world state that now exists. State collapse does not create new narrative. It converts accumulated narrative state into a defined result. You're no longer asking, what should happen now? You're asking, given the state of the world, what does this resolve into? This distinction is important. Choice produces state, state produces outcome. State collapse is the formal bridge between the two. State collapse is driven primarily by our defined resolution interface, the small, explicitly designed set of rules that describes how final flag states translate into outcomes. And we have already generated the variables involved in reverse design. Our resolution interface will define which combinations of flags matter, how those combinations interact, and what results they produce. Importantly, the resolution interface is created during preparation, not during play. This is what allows it to remain consistent, transparent, and mechanically dependable. The GM is not inventing meaning, they're reading meaning from a predefined interpretive structure. The possibilities of the ending are not the goal. Clarity in our ending is our goal. Nonlinear narrative does not require infinite endings. It requires endings that meaningfully reflect the journey the players took. State collapse allows many different journeys to converge into a small, intentional set of outcomes without erasing player impact. This is the core trade. We intentionally reduce the number of final outcomes in exchange for dramatically increasing how those outcomes reflect play. At the moment of collapse, resolution should feel almost mechanical. This is not a weakness of the system. In fact, it's the payoff. The cognitive labor has already been done during design. Scope was constrained through reverse design. Variables were controlled through method-agnostic conditional flags. Complexity was curated through the pipeline, and now the GM simply evaluates the final flag states and applies the resolution interface. If reverse design defines what matters, conditional flags track what happens, then state collapse determines what it means. Without state collapse, flags only describe history. With it, flags become your narrative engine. And this step turns bookkeeping into authorship. State collapse allows thousands of possible narrative permutations to resolve into meaningful, usable results in seconds. Returning to our working example from Brumblegrove, at this point in the arc, all 3 quests have been completed. The flag pipeline is finished. We now have a final, fully populated set of surviving flags. Our task is no longer to interpret events, our task is to resolve state. From reverse design, we already know the only variables that are allowed to exit this arc: the herd leader, whether Aurora possesses a valid patriarchal puppet, whether the herd is politically stable, which heirs survived, and the effective strength of the Bellborn host. Everything else has already been consumed by the pipeline. These values form the complete input vector for state collapse. The first collapse layer determines whether the herd can function as a coherent political and military actor. The resolution interface for stability is: the herd is stable if the herd leader is Burl, or the herd leader is Aurora, and a valid patriarchal puppet exists. Any other configuration produces a fractured herd. This single rule collapses multiple political and survival flags into one binary outcome. Next, we collapse leadership legitimacy. If Aurora is the ruling figure, a second collapse rule is evaluated. If a valid patriarchal puppet is present, her leadership is recognized. If not, her leadership is treated as illegitimate. This rule doesn't generate a new variable. It determines how the existing leadership variable is interpreted by the world. Next, the surviving heir flags are evaluated. For each prince, if the prince is alive and the herd is stable, then that prince is available as a contributing asset. If the herd is fractured, surviving heirs do not contribute. Additionally, if Aurora is ruling through Haywain as a puppet, and Haywain is dead, the herd is immediately reclassified as fractured. This is how an earlier pipeline flag, for example, Cloverhide respecting the party, can ripple all the way to the final result without ever becoming a new end-state variable. Finally, we will evaluate the final strength of the Bellborn host. The resolution interface defines a baseline contribution of 6 power if the herd is stable. However, if the heiress Princess Petunia was spared, the shame causes desertion and you lose 1 power of the 6. Additionally, casualties suffered during the internal conflict can further reduce this by 1 each, resulting in a range between 3 and 6. This final numeric output represents how much power the herd contributes later in the campaign, and if the herd is fractured, the host contribution is nullified entirely. Now, notice at no point in this process did we reference how the players behaved, what scenes occurred, what tactics were used, or how any conflict felt at the table. We evaluated only state. Multiple flags were collapsed into 1 political stability value, 1 legitimacy interpretation, a set of available assets, and a single operational unit strength. That is state collapse. This Brumble Grove arc supports thousands of possible internal permutations. Different combinations of allegiances, deaths, and political maneuvers can occur during play. But the resolution interface is deliberately small. The collapse rules convert that complexity into a handful of usable results. The GM does not need to remember the story, just read the state. Notice what this system guarantees. Every important action can influence the outcome, and no action must be anticipated in advance. This is what allows player freedom to coexist with authored outcomes. In a matter of seconds, the GM can determine whether the herd answers the call, who stands at its head, which figures arrive, and how strong that force actually is. This arc resolves into mechanical and narrative assets that the rest of the campaign can reliably consume. This is not branching narrative, it's a resolution engine. State collapse turns narrative state into narrative consequence. Not by prediction, not by improvisation, by design. Nonlinear storytelling doesn't fail because of a lack of creativity. It fails because creativity alone does not produce a resolvable system. Reverse design constrains what is allowed to matter, conditional flags convert play into readable state, and state collapse turns that state into outcomes that actually pay off. Together, these tools let you run an open-ended game without surrendering authorship at the moment it matters most, the ending. You no longer need to predict a story, you just resolve it.